President Biden is creating a bipartisan commission to study any potential changes to the U.S. Supreme Court. He signed an executive action Friday establishing a 36-member panel to discuss the, quote, merits and legality of any reforms. On the table are things like expanding the number of justices and imposing term limits instead of lifetime appointments. The commission was one of President Biden's campaign promises. Here's then candidate Biden speaking with Norah O'Donnell on 60 Minutes right before the election.
And I will ask them to, over 180 days, come back to me with recommendations as to how to reform the court system, because it's getting out of whack, the way in which it's being handled. And it's not about court packing. There's a number of other things that our constitutional scholars have debated, and I'd look to see what recommendations that commission might make.
So you're telling us you're going to study this issue about whether to pack the court?
No, whether there's a number of alternatives that go well beyond packing.
This is a live ball.
Oh, it is a live ball.
The White House says the commission will include members from the full political spectrum. Democrats heightened calls for reform after President Trump appointed 3 justices during his term. The court now has a conservative tilt, 6-3. For more, let's bring in California Democratic Congressman Ro Khanna. Congressman, welcome. Thanks very much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So President Biden has refused to say whether he supports any changes to the Supreme Court, though the move, this one, seems to indicate that he would. As someone who has been a vocal supporter of some reforms, would you like to see the White House take a firmer stance when it comes to specific issues like adding justices or imposing term limits?
I think the president is doing exactly the right thing. He promised on the campaign he would create a commission. He's followed through and is creating a commission. The commission is going to have some of the leading scholars from our nation and a diverse group. I have a proposal that is an 18-year term for Supreme Court justices. I think that would reduce the stakes of each justice appointment. It would not be packing the court or be ideological. The Washington Post actually just endorsed the idea. So I hope the commission will consider that as one of the alternatives. But I applaud the approach the president is taking.
Well, Justice Stephen Breyer is the longest-serving liberal-leaning member of the Supreme Court. Last week, he warned that expanding the court could weaken trust, saying, quote, "It is wrong to think of the court as another political institution." Are you concerned, Congressman, that reforms could undermine the court's credibility?
I agree with Justice Breyer that we should not politicize the court. That's why I think that term limits actually would depoliticize the court. One of the reasons we have these high-stakes confirmation hearings every 5-10 years is that people fear that these individuals being appointed will be there for 40-50 years. That wasn't the founders' intent. The founders thought that after someone had a distinguished legal career, they would serve on the Supreme Court as sort of the capstone and wouldn't be there for 40 or 50 years. And we need to return to that. So I actually think that the term limits would depoliticize the court and allow it to be independent of our daily politics.
On this issue of court packing, do you think that has the potential to backfire?
Well, I don't know who's talking about that. Right now, people are talking about term limits, some of the other issues. So I would look, that's what our bill is. It's about term limits, and that has broad support. 70% of the American people think that you shouldn't have someone appointed who stays on the court for 40 or 50 years. I mean, think about this right now. There's people on the Supreme Court right now who were appointed by President Bush Sr., and they're making decisions in modern-day America. Something seems off about that, and that's really, I think, what the commission should look at.
Realistically, though, Congressman, given the political atmosphere right now when it comes to any kind of reforms with regard to the Supreme Court, what do you think the chances are, whether it be a proposal like yours with 18-year term limits or something else?
I think it's hard. I mean, it's in candor, but when you look at something like term limits, it has broad public support, and that could be a compromise because it's not favoring Republicans or Democrats. It's giving every president an equal chance to appoint justices. You could even have some form of grandfathering to make it fair. And I think that that's the type of compromise and reform that people want, which is not saying that we're pushing for one ideology, but we're doing something that's common sense.
On another topic, the White House asked Congress to authorize its nearly $1.5 trillion federal budget Friday. We're already seeing rifts in the Democratic Party when it comes to the proposed defense portion of the budget. Congressman, where would you like to see spending prioritized, and how is the White House juggling what the more progressive and moderate wings of the party want?
Well, I appreciated the president's domestic agenda, where he increased funding for education, where he increased funding for our safety net. But I was disappointed that he's increasing defense spending, especially because some of that defense spending is on traditional defense that's not as relevant to modern national security, where we should be focused on cybersecurity. We should be focused on a response to pandemics. We should be focused on climate change threats. And even in terms of the competition with China, we should be focused on AI and leading in technology. So I did not think that the priorities of the budget were all aligned with our modern day national security. And I think we ought to be trying to return to President Obama levels of defense spending as opposed to increasing beyond what President Trump did.
And where else do you see differences? Were there other areas that you were, shall we say, disappointed in when it came to the budget?
Well, I think the defense is the area that we're going higher than Trump, as opposed to returning to the vision that President Obama had. I think that is the area that stood out. And it's not just about the top line numbers. It's also about, do we understand the challenges of security in the modern world? People have the biggest security that cost 500,000 American lives. More than that has been the pandemic. What are we doing about that? We have a challenge of climate change that is affecting people's security. What are we doing about that? If we really have a competition with China, what are we doing to make sure that we are leading in the technologies of the future? Senator Schumer and I have a bipartisan bill, the Endless Frontiers, to put $100 billion in critical industries. Those are the things that will make us safer, as opposed to more doubling down on legacy industry.
Finally, Congressman, the Senate is expected to soon hold a vote on hate crimes legislation aimed at stopping the uptick in violence against the Asian American and Pacific Islander community. Congressman, your chamber is working on a similar measure, but realistically, what do you think can be done to address this?
Well, it's a good start, and I want to give Grace Meng and our chair of KPEC, Judy Chu, credit for their advocacy over the years. And we obviously need to increase the reporting of hate crimes and hate incidents, have increased penalties for hate crimes. But really, it's a much deeper issue. And it goes back to understanding all the way from the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 19th century to the Japanese internment, to the discrimination against Japanese Americans in the 1980s when we saw Japan as a rising economic power, to the profiling of Arab Americans after 9/11, that immigrant communities, particularly certain immigrant communities from Asia, but frankly from also the Middle East, have been vulnerable and not always treated with equal respect. And we have to really understand that history to be able to overcome it.
Congressman Ro Khanna, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
For a deeper dive into this issue, make sure to stream the latest episode of our CBSN original series, Speaking Frankly. It looks at the growing calls to reform the Supreme Court. You can stream it now at cbsnews.com/SCOTUS.